Hey everybody, this is Nevin Gusak, your host for the Patriotic Populist program. With me is my guest, Joshua Noyer, who is the founder and chairman of the National Reformation Party. How you doing today, Josh?
Good, Nevin. Thank you for having me tonight. I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so do I. I have a feeling this is going to be several conversations spanning several shows. Little introduction about Josh. Josh lives out in California. He's a family man, loving father, lover of books, history, and is a bit of a political activist, I would say. A little bit of an understatement. Josh is in. Do you mind if I call you Josh or Joshua, or does it not?
Josh works.
Josh works. Okay. I have a cousin named Josh too. So, anyways, so we're going to go through Joshua's political evolution. Now, Joshua started out like Herschel and I. All three of us have this in common. We started our political journey as libertarian-leaning conservatives or Reaganites. In the case of Josh and I, we experienced a journey through the John Birch Society. So I really want to kind of give the microphone to Josh. And Josh, I want you to elaborate more about your political journey. What attracted you to the Republican Party, Reaganism, and then the John Birch Society? What appealed to you, and how did you get interested in politics in the first place?
Politics really came about, it was through my journey into a love of history. I love studying about the European wars, colonial era, Napoleon, Waterloo, World War I, World War II. And that kind of historical fascination led me into politics because, to be succinct, history and politics are different versions of the same animal. What attracted me to conservatism and the Republican Party originally, at least from a young age, was the emphasis they supposedly put on freedom. Freedom, liberty. When they would talk about the free market, economics, how it's connected to personal freedom, it sounded very good. It sounded like, hey, the Democrats, those on the left, just want to oppress people. They want more government in your lives. And the idea that government staying out of the personal realm and the economic realm sounded very, very good. And so originally I was a pretty typical conservative, but through reading more of the literature and becoming more knowledgeable, I would think, about what I was reading, it led me to a more extreme version of that conservatism. That's when I joined the John Birch Society. And I spent my teenage years in the JBS, but I think near the end of that time is when I started to become disenchanted with conservatism and what I was hearing. That didn't automatically lead to my navigating to something else immediately. That was a journey that took a long time, but that disenchantment, I think, first appeared during my early 20s. And so that's at that point is when I left the John Birch Society, and I was kind of out in the political wilderness for a good decade or so. And at that point, I realized, hey, conservatism, the Republican Party, something's not right here. Something is not working. Something is wrong about conservatism. And I realized that all of the propaganda, all of the works, all of the books I had read, from Barry Goldwater to Ronald Reagan, William Bennett, Newt Gingrich, all of those characters, they were selling me a bill of goods. And the more and more I heard, and I think the last straw on this was Ron Paul. I originally liked a lot of what Ron Paul said when he first ran, but then again, during the middle of that campaign, it's at that point when I officially broke from conservatism, because I realized that a lot of the numbers and things I was seeing did not make any sense. government staying out of the private sphere, government staying out of the economy did not produce wealth for all. It did not produce a more just society. It produced exactly the opposite. It produced a lot of people at the top that were very wealthy, but the even greater percentage of the population at the bottom was worse and worse and worse. And that was exactly due to conservative ideology and the belief in free markets and small government. Because just because the government stays out of the social realm or the economic realm, conservatives want you to believe that's going to lead to an increase in freedom. Like it's a forget the word. It's a win-lose situation. Zero sum game. That's what I was looking for. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was not what I was seeing. I was seeing an increase in drug addiction, suicides, poverty, all of this resulting from conservative policies. And so I eventually reached a point about 11, 12, 13 years ago, somewhere around that time, where I just cut myself off from conservatism because it was selling us a bill of goods that were just, it wasn't worth anything. It was actually leading to a lot of the problems that they decried. And I no longer had tolerance for it. And that's when I founded the American Black Shirts Party back in 2013. And that's what really has led us up to today.
Well, before we go into your political transition to what I would term a non-racial form of fascism, I have a couple of follow-up questions. First of all, what was the straw that broke the camel's back? You mentioned several things that conservatism really did not conserve the best of America. I would argue that Reaganite sort of Tea Party conservatism, all they really end up conserving is the aggregate political and economic power, the political power and the economic wealth of the private sector oligarchs. That's really all they seek to conserve. Everything else is just, used as wedge issues, or they want this sort of ideological mishmash of an extreme social conservatism which penalizes powerless individuals but yet gives a free pass to the depredations and really the treason of the heart of private sector oligarchs. So what was the straw that broke the camel's back? You mentioned something briefly about also Ron Paul. You liked what Ron Paul had to say, but what did it in for you for Ron Paul? So if you could answer those two questions, I think we probably can get some interesting feedback from you.
I don't know if there was one particular moment that did it for me. I think it was a process that began once I got out of college and I moved out on my own. I could see the effects of policies all around me. I could see the gangs. I could see drug addiction affecting people. I saw the effects on the economy from people earning low wages, people working for years at the same job, not being able to keep up, not being able to pay rent, not being able to pay housing costs. And I was able to put two and two together and realize, hey, the government staying out of the economy is allowing people to be exploited. And in turn, when people are exploited and have to live in horrid, terrible conditions, barely able to make ends meet, that produces a lot of social pathologies that really lead to the decay of society. So I don't know if there's one particular moment, but it was a string of things, one leading to another, which just, it led me to just disengage, not only from Republicans, because I didn't think the Democrats or the left really was an answer at all, but from politics in general, more so conservatives, because that's where I came from on the political sphere. And I had to sit back and recollect on my own political journey. And I realized how I was taken down the river by people who were dishonest and intellectually feeble, just to say the least. Yeah,
what did it in for you for Ron Paul? What turned your stomach about him, or
the extremeness in which he, I think the extremeness of his economic views. I liked Ron Paul when it came to foreign policy to a large extent because at the time, and I still am to a large extent, I'm a non-interventionist and I don't like to see all these foreign wars across the globe, which to me seem to serve more corporate interests than they do people here at home. And that originally attracted me to a large extent to Paul, but his extreme libertarianism, and I realized that, hey, that his economic policies are going to override any good he could do when it comes to foreign policy.
And what was I going to say? So what, you mentioned that you weren't attracted to the left wing of the Democratic Party. Why did you not choose the left wing of the Democratic Party, or even the existing organized communist or socialist groups in the United States? What turned you off about them? Why didn't you just embrace the, quote, other side? And there are plenty of Marxist-Leninist politicians in California at the time. I mean, even today, you got Barbara Lee, who, collaborated with the Cubans and the Sandinistas. She worked with Ronald Dellums, the former congressman, who basically was Moscow's man in the U.S. Congress and everything, and then, the Democratic Party, of course, from our standpoint of the show, contains about 2 or 3 different factions. And for the most part, we have some agreements with all of them, particularly sometimes the progressives, but they have 2 problematic factions: LC, Bill Clinton type Democrats, and then you have the progressive left, and then you have the extreme left to add a third option or a third faction. Why didn't you go in that direction? I mean, after all, there's an alternative, right?
Well, you like to think so, but what I had come to realize was that I think that the state itself is a collective good. It exists for the benefit of mankind, and when you see a reduction in state authority, and when the state kind of subtracts from society, I think it leads to not a diminution of power, but it leads to power being assumed by other private sector actors. So I believe that the state has a role not only in the economy, but the state has a role in society, in social issues. And so what really left me disenchanted with the left was that they wanted a completely hands-off approach when it came to society, when it came to social issues. Whereas when it came to the economy, they wanted a more hands-on approach. They had a more moral point of view when it came to the economy. So there's a disconnect there. Why is it more moral for the government to be involved in supply and demand in the economy when it's immoral for them to be involved in society? And the Republicans had the same issue, but you have to flip it a little bit. Why is it moral for the government to restrict abortion or to restrict marriage, but it's immoral for the government to involve itself in economic affairs, involve itself with healthcare? So for me, there really wasn't an option on either side. In addition, a lot of the morality preached by Democrats when it comes to the economy, a lot of the involvement they preach, is really window dressing to a large extent. They really don't offer much in the way of alternatives to the Republican Party. They really haven't for a long time. There's been certain individuals on the far left that have, but your typical Democratic politician does not. I think Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are excellent examples of that. They're just as corporately aligned as Republicans, even though their rhetoric would lead you to believe something that's not. So even today, I mean, there are certain things that I agree with when it comes to the Republican Party and conservatives. There are certain things that the Democrats and the left I agree with, but as entities in themselves, they're really not either side. Neither side is really an acceptable alternative at this point.
Okay, so you were in the political wilderness. You were like me and Herschel, and I would suspect other Americans who chose varied political paths. Herschel is the patriotic populism, or as I would call it, radical civic nationalism. But you chose fascism. And what in the world made you choose fascism? Now, this is for the audience who doesn't know. I've written books about fascism. No disrespect intended when I say this to Josh. Extremist ideologies of all stripes always fascinated me. And I've read quite a bit about communism and fascism, and I can rattle off the programs and the history of many a fascist party and even communist party. It's interesting, and they have interesting views, and they are byproducts of decaying plutocratic, oligarchic governments and economic structures. I can understand why people join these parties or adhere to these movements, of which on this show we are adamantly opposed. No disrespect intended. But I think it's important to get a dialogue going to understand why people, intelligent people or well-meaning people, join these political movements or get attracted, because I look at it as a failing business in denial. That's what the United States of America is right now. By first world standards, we are a failing business in denial. And an effective business, if you're failing, you can't be in denial. You have to go back to the drawing board and say, where did we go wrong? How do we fix it without sacrificing too much of our core principles? And that's the path that Herschel and I chose. Now, our positions are radical compared to our previous political worldviews or previous political ideologies and affiliations. I mean, I campaigned for different Republican candidates. I've appeared on conservative-leaning shows, more populist conservative shows or nationalist conservative shows, and I have more in common with them than the Reaganites. But I left all that behind, and I'm not looking back. I'm looking forward. Josh, quick point. Didn't you work for some political campaigns for various presidential candidates, or am I inaccurate?
No, I didn't work. I was involved to a certain extent with Pat Buchanan previously, distributing literature, campaign rallies, things like that. Never an official worker with it, but I was a supporter of Buchanan for his couple of runs at the presidency.
Now, Buchanan actually was not a small government conservative in certain key areas. So I'm sure being involved with Buchanan's campaign and even being exposed to his books like The Great Betrayal, which I have in my personal library, which is his criticism of free trade economics, I'm sure that also opened your eyes too as well, being exposed to the Buchanan campaign. I mean, the trade issue was one of the hooks in seeing the deindustrialization of where I grew up in the greater New York City, New Jersey area that really opened my eyes. But this show is not about me and my transition, it's about you. So what in the world attracted you to fascism? Because I'm sure you get that question all the time in interviews.
Well, like I told you, part of me comes from the left, part of me comes from the right, and right in the middle you have the state. I have believed that the state is an intrinsic good. And I saw one at the time, I saw one political ideology which represented the state, had the state as central to itself. And that was fascism. Mm. All aspects of it were about the state and state authority and integrating individuals, integrating social groups, integrating all aspects of society into the state. So you can avoid that issue of when you reduce state authority, you have private sector actors assuming control. Instead, you have the state, which is supposed to be a neutral authority representing the good of everybody in control of society. And that really attracted me. There was also corporatism, which I thought was a good, but I still do think is a good middle ground between the extremes of the free market and collective socialism. I thought it was beautiful how it was articulated in the literature from Alfredo Rocco, from Ugo Spirito, individuals like that. I thought it worked out ideally in theory. So that attracted it to that. I was attracted to that. I was also attracted to the theories of Giovanni Gentili and the spiritual nature of the state, the spiritual nature of the nation. And so all of these different aspects at the time seemed to me like parts of my political philosophy that were missing, because I couldn't find these ideas anywhere else. There was not that alternative within American politics. I couldn't see it anywhere else within history. So to me, fascism seemed a unique, original alternative at the time that was addressing issues that was addressed nowhere else in history or in political theory. So I mean, back in 2013, that's what attracted me to fascism, in particular, the one of Benito Mussolini in fascist Italy, Giovanni Gentili, Alfredo Rocco, individuals that represented the regime. And I read the literature, the works, and it seemed like that was what I've been missing all of these years.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So then you started the American Black Shirts Party as a result. I mean, how did that come about? Where did you start to seek people? And of course, if you're not comfortable giving information to the audience, I respect that. But how did you go about? Did you have friends that were going through a similar transition, becoming disillusioned with conservatism, and then you gathered them together and were like, hey, let's do something about it and form this party?
No, actually, I was approached by one other individual out on the East Coast, and he felt the same as I did. And so
this was really a friend of yours, or just
no, actually I had not known him, and he approached me, and we began discussing politics and discussing just the dearth of alternatives here in the United States. And him, like myself, we realized, hey, we both believe in this, and we have literally nowhere else to go, because all these other groups which would have said that they believed in fascism, in actuality were just racial nationalist groups that really never expanded beyond white nationalism. And so we said, hey, let's take a chance, let's do this. And so that was what really led to the formation of the ABP, me and this other individual. And at that point, we just expanded from there. And as you know, we've discussed it previously, and we grew to include a lot of other people and individuals.
Mm-hmm. So what made you reject racialism? Because you're one of the few fascist political parties that really have ever existed that really rejected racialism, and that includes anti-Jewish prejudices. Why did you do that? Did you ever flirt with anti-Semitism at all? I mean, it doesn't sound like throughout the party's history, from what I've read of its literature and our discussions, that it really ever delved into that. So why did you reject that kind of worldview?
Well, just to be a decent person, I think. I mean, I've always looked at my own politics, my own philosophy, as an outgrowth of who I am. Mm-hmm. And so when I really when I really articulated an idea and a philosophy, I like to think that it represented my own ideals. I have never put out there as an idea something that I disliked, something that I did not agree with. And so I think a lot of people who join groups which use the fascist label try to adapt themselves to that label. And so, and overwhelmingly in the media, that word is associated with anti-Semitism, it's associated with racism. So people try to form themselves into that negative ideal. I have always rejected that. And in fact, as I'm sure we'll discuss later, the dissolution of the ABP is connected with that. It's connected with adopting somebody else's, a historical name, a historical ideal, which really it puts you in a box as far as what to believe. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's just due to, I look at politics as being a form of self-expression. Politics is not separate from morality. It's not separate from ethics. It's not separate from the individual that adopts a certain particular point of view. It is, I like to think that politics is like a work of art. It's like writing. It's like painting. It's an expression of who we are as individuals. So the idea of trying to form myself into like a fascist ideal, which comes from an interpretation of history, has always been repulsive to my state of mind. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I have never believed in those things, and so I did not include them in the party at all.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, and I think that's a wise move, both not only morally from my standpoint, and I'm sure Herschel would agree with me on this, but also it's not politically practical. Whether we like it or not, America is a multiracial country, and there are Americans of good faith and good intention in all races that would fight for the national ideal, whether politically or lay their lives down on the line. And these are people that we should not reject as a matter of practical politics. And, I'm going to be honest with you a little bit about me. The audience knows this already. I mean, I interracially date. The woman who I'm seeing almost 5 months and 2 weeks is of Cuban origin and is brown skinned. If you go to my Facebook page, it's a picture of her. And, I work in a multiracial community. I live in a multiracial community. Eventually, be moving hopefully to Tampa in a year and a half. That's a city in Florida. And that's also multiracial. And I look at these people as either aspiring Americans becoming citizens, the ones who are doing it, the right way, or people who are fellow Americans to begin with, who love the country and want to see the country succeed just as much as a natural born American. So I look at that, and there are many people of different colors that have fought under the flag, who have died under the flag, including some that I have taken snippets of their worldviews and incorporated in my unique political ideology, and it goes from there. One of the things where I think I would depart from you to a degree, that I think it's more of a challenge. You mentioned, and I might be butchering your thoughts here, about your conception of the state as being moral or innately or intrinsically a good thing. And I kind of look at a state as kind of like a gun or a baseball bat. It could be used for good things, but it also could be used for bad things. And I look at capitalism, I look at labor unions in the same way. They're not intrinsically good or bad. It depends on the individual, the population, or the ruling group that are using the gun, or using the baseball bat, or using the state and the state power, and the sticky wicket here, the $64,000 question or challenge, is finding a morally suitable leadership class that won't abuse its power when you're governing a particular country. And you see the abuses of state power in National Socialist Germany, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Communist China, neo-KGB ruled Russia, North Korea. But we also see the evils of a paralyzed government or an impotent government. We see that in the United States. You look at the abuses of the horrible labor practices at times of Walmart or Amazon or certain auto parts plants in the South. That in 2017, there was a big write-up, I think, in the Atlantic magazine, where you have really horrible things going on against the workers there. Injuries, death, I mean, horrible stuff. So you see that problem as well going on. And I see a problem even in fascist Italy. In Francisco Franco's Spain, you had a highly ultra-regulated economy that did kill legitimate private initiative, but also crushed labor too as well, that regulated them. Yes, there were certain arguable benefits, Doppel Lavoro and the Kraft durch Freud and National Socialist Germany and all the rest of it, but at the same time, you have this form of oppression which is not good. And that form of oppression, of course, as I said, does not happen in a vacuum. This happens when you have an impotent, incompetent, or purposely paralyzed government that really is just a manservant for the plutocratic oligarchs. One example of how sort of your Tea Party-ish kind of economics of limited government or total anti-welfare state, Mark Blythe wrote about this in his book Austerity, which is on my bookshelf, and I quoted in my latest book, Turning the Page, where it talked about how austerity-based economics, austerity being a part of neoliberalism or market fundamentalism, led to the rise of militaristic type of fascism amongst the Japanese officers, which were getting more and more powers in the 1930s, or in National Socialist Germany, where even the Social Democrats were voting against unemployment, extended unemployment benefits at a time when Germany was hurting to the extreme. So my approach is to start something perhaps different, but not so different. And I look to my roots, which is aspects of what FDR had to say, Alexander Hamilton, Theodore Roosevelt, even George Washington, who had, in his farewell address, warned against factionalism and political party divisions and foreign entanglements and the degree of foreign influence, that could enter the United States and its governance. All prophetic warnings, Abraham Lincoln, the American School of Political Economy, all of this, and certain aspects of conservative policies too as well, foreign policy, a consistent stand against communism and other forms of totalitarianism, collectivist totalitarianism. And I blended it all into this ideology called radical civic nationalism. And it could be exemplified by a quote by Franklin Roosevelt, where he said, "In our personal ambitions, we are individualists, but in our seeking for economic and political progress as a nation, we all go up or else all go down as one people." And for a while, when our nation adhered to FDR's stated belief here, the country was moving forward on all fronts, on the racial issue, on the issue of racial segregation. Capitalism was stabilized. The American people, there was a lot more social trust within the American people than there is now. You actually had, the ironic thing is that you had this sort of combination of American School of Political Economy, morality, traditional morality, and patriotism, if you will, or a civic nationalism that really, our country really did well. Ironically, it was people like FDR and some of the pre-Reagan type of Republicans that actually were more conservative than the 1980s style conservatives. But getting back to my original question, how do you prevent the abuses of power when you believe the state is intrinsically good? And to me, it's just an either or proposition. because we've seen horrible human rights violations committed by highly centralized authoritarian states, just like we see atrocities by when you have a government that's totally impotent and paralyzed and captured by corporate capitalist interests.
I'm not going to deny that throughout history, the state, while being a moral good, has also committed atrocities. I mean, plenty. I mean, you're a student of history as well, so you realize that. But all kinds of institutions, all kinds of groups are responsible for the same thing. We can look at the history of the church. We can even look at the history of families. I mean, how many children have been abused or killed by parents? Does that mean that the family is a neutral institution, that it's not an intrinsic good? No. Does that mean the church is an intrinsic bad, or it's a neutral institution? I don't think so. In fact, if you look back through history, especially over the last couple of centuries, what you see is abuses of state power are more the result of a state that starts to collapse and can't maintain itself, and thereby instigates a revolution. Look back at revolutionary France and see a result of that, how the monarchy fell apart economically, wasn't able to support itself. And so a revolution came about which really destroyed the state and then implemented something in its place that really was not representative of that society. We could look back at Soviet Russia doing the same thing, how the czars, through their participation in the First World War, had really destroyed the economy and the social fabric. And so it brought about a revolution which the people as a whole were not aligned with. Same thing with communist China, how Chiang Kai-shek had really mismanaged China, and some of the results from World War II had created the same conditions there. We could talk about Spain, Portugal undergoing the same process. Whenever you have a government and a state that breaks down and is replaced by a revolutionary group, that revolutionary group is not representative of the society in which it wants to govern. And when you have that, you have a dichotomy there which really isn't functioning. And so that revolutionary group, to achieve its aims, those aims become more and more abstract because they're unrealizable with the society that they're trying to govern. And so you have the massacres, you have the killings, you have the oppression in society as they try to realize these abstract freedoms and liberties which just aren't realizable. Now, this doesn't cover every single state throughout history, but I would argue that, especially in more recent times, this covers a majority of instances where the state was abused. Now, I don't think that means that the state is not an intrinsic good. Our view within the NRP has always been that the state is an outgrowth of the human family. So if you go back, if we can go back into history and imagine the formation of the state, it comes from the family, because you have the mother, the father, you have the siblings, you have extended relatives. And so within that structure, you have rules, you have customs, you have norms which are starting to form. And as that family and that extended family grows and becomes larger and larger, those norms and those customs become laws and institutions. And so that connection between the family and the state makes the state at least to us, it makes it an integral moral good, an integral institution for society. Now, it's still prone to abuses, like even the families are today, and really good institutions are today. But we think that it has a place, and it has a very noble and virtuous purpose.
Well, and it's interesting you point that out, because, our position is that one of the ways that, checks and balances could be put in place is, of course, having a constitution. You and I have had this discussion before. However, at the same time, constitutions, from our position, or my personal position, need to be updated to confront the problems of the day. And remember, the Constitution was a compromise between the anti-federalists, who were the extreme anti-statists, and the Federalists. So it was the melding of two diametrically opposed political positions, if you will. So bear that in mind. And the Anti-Federalists, I mean, they also had their checkered point of view. They tended more often than not to be aligned with the slaveholding plantation interests too as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, those of you in the audience, and Josh as well. So we have to, the Constitution has to evolve, and you have to have a population, I think, that is politically aware, that is moral. Really, I would like to see a government that is truly reflective of the best in society. And that doesn't mean the rich people, often quite a few super wealthy people that are actually not the best people in society. There are some exceptions, of course. But really the best talent out there. And there are a lot of smart people that I've come across here in the United States of differing walks of life and different social classes, genders, etc. But I look at the state as something that is necessary. And to me, a state's purpose is not only national defense, or the common defense, as they said in the Constitution, and domestic tranquility, but also survival as a nation. And the reason why I am for an updated Constitution, because there are interests of the far communist left, as well as the corporate right, the corporations that use the loopholes and the liberalism inherent within our Constitution as a means of overthrowing it. And this is where we have to make hard choices, because our country is kind of like a family. We want everybody to be individuals. It's very important. It's innate to the American DNA. Very few people want to live in a collectivist despotism. But on the other hand, there are also, when you have an impotent government that is in the hands of private oligarchical interests, you also get a new form of soft tyranny as well. You have tremendous political power. And as Karl Marx said, correctly, I might add, in the Communist Manifesto, that the bourgeoisie contains its own gravediggers. And this is very true. I don't like Karl Marx. I don't like what he actually called for. I don't agree with the class struggle. And I don't agree with most of his measures because it's inherently authoritarian, as he laid out in the end of the manifesto and his program. So there has to be a firewall between the self-serving oligarchical private sector interests in order for the nation to survive. And that is, my view, comes from a constitutional tradition. There are some of our founding fathers and early leaders, Thomas Jefferson, Martin Van Buren, I think even Andrew Jackson, they all were very concerned about the proliferation of the political power of high finance in this country. Didn't mean they wanted to go and nationalize it, shoot the bankers, but there needed to be common sense laws to check their power. And this is where a new constitution that expands upon the old or existing constitution, there needs to be new rights added into the Constitution, as well as new responsibilities codified in the Constitution. One example is banning right to work and recognizing collective bargaining as a constitutional right that should not be abridged. And because there needs to be a better equilibrium between labor and capital in this country, or labor and management. Right now, everything favors management and the employers, and basically labor is being crapped upon collectively. When you take a look at the trade with totalitarian powers, for example, I mean, that's treason. Amazon, Jeff Bezos, Walmart, they make a lot of money from doing business with communist China. That's wrong. We are virulent anti-communists here on this show. So the state is inherently, can be a good thing. It's a necessary thing, because without a somewhat strong or authoritative state, it is our position on this show that this country will decline. We see economic decline since at least the 1970s, late 1970s. We see military decline in this country compared to the total power of Russia and China. You know, we see our country, younger people being more attracted to socialism, some cases even communism, according to polls out there. You know, even people attracted to neo-Nazism, like Matt Heimbach, a traditional workers' party, which now he's no longer a leader of, and I think now he's becoming a pro-white national Bolshevik, so I've read. He gave very legitimate reasons why he embraced National Socialism, because of the failure of a corporate-captured so-called liberal state. You know, our impotent, paralyzed government that's dominated by plutocratic interests. So from our position, or my position, we have to survive as a country. This is our home. Because eventually the engine is going to break down. It's going to be like a seized up car engine because you haven't changed the oil in a year. That's our country's economy. That's our country's political system. It's like a seized up car engine that ceases working because you haven't changed the oil. And this is what led me to make a jump from a small government conservative to a non-ideological radical civic nationalist. Now, yes, I have certain leftover libertarian conservative sensibilities. But if you want to preserve that in any reasonable fashion, government is not the boogeyman necessarily, big government. See, when you look at the big versus small government is really in the American context is very fallacious. It really is. Because who dominates the government? You and me? I don't think so. There have been studies, Benjamin Gillens, and I forget the co-author of the study. They were Princeton University and Northwestern University. And they co-authored a study back in 2014, which indicated that, based on congressional voting records, that it doesn't reflect the will of the average American. And this is the problem. And eventually people will be out in the streets. It will collapse. Russia and China and their allies throughout Latin America, Asia, Middle East, elsewhere, they're gunning for the United States and the West. They are. And they've become powerful in part because Western capitalists and American capitalists have been sending them quite a bit of technology. And the NATO countries and the neutral countries and Japan and Taiwan to China and the United States. And this led me to believe that this is not an aberration of unchecked capitalism. This is the logical conclusion of unchecked capitalism, where capitalists capture the government, and then the government is a schizophrenic foreign policy here, which is, on the one hand, we're going to spend a lot of money on the military and let the defense contractors gouge us and overcharge for services and weapons and have this huge military budget. And I'm not for a tiny military, mind you. Not at all. On the contrary, we need massive military investment, but there's also quite a bit of gouging. And then on the other hand, we're also exporting high technology to Russia and China, which are our two biggest enemies and most powerful enemies that have the capability to basically defeat us in the battlefield and even perhaps occupy a weakened United States. So this is what caused me to revise my limited government views. Whereas if you want to preserve freedom as a whole and the survivability of our country, we need to go back to the drawing board. We can't be like a business in denial. We can't be a failing business in denial. We have to look at the reality of our situation, put the big boy pants on, and really move forward. This is no time for blind nostalgia for the pioneer days. states, you know, the Little House on the Prairie and everything else. Because let me tell you, at the rate this country is going, Little House on the Prairie will be far gone, and you'll have either a Mad Max hellscape, or you'll have Red Dawn, or you have the Man in the High Castle, which is, of course, a book and a series on Amazon, fictionalized, thankfully, about an Axis occupation of the United States. You know, these movements don't come out of nowhere. Fascism doesn't come out of nowhere. I don't like fascism. I mean, not to disrespect you, Josh. I like Josh very much, personally, and I respect his intellect. But I don't like fascism. I don't like National Socialism. I don't like Islamism and communism. But all that doesn't come out of a vacuum. That comes out of failed states, failing societies. If you don't believe me, read it in my book, Turning the Page. So I guess I kind of gave my stump speech here, next political campaign, eh? So what made, fast forward to recent times, what made you depart from fascism?
There were a few different reasons. Let me go through them one by one. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't involve myself in politics for any ulterior purposes. I don't involve myself in politics to promote a particular ideology or philosophy, or I don't pretend that me personally, I'm going to save the world. I'm going to cure hunger. We're going to install world peace, like some people claim to do to get involved in politics. Politics to me is about personal expression. It's an artistic form. It's how we express ourselves. And so the American Black Church Party, which was formed in 2013, had one fatal flaw to it. And that was in the name and in what we were promoting. American Black Shirts brings back early 1920s Italy, the Squadrissimo, the violence and the activism surrounding that. So number one, we had named ourselves after a group, an organization, which was not American, which was a historical movement. The next problem we had was with fascism. Fascism, again, was a historical movement from 1920s to 1945. It was based in history. And so with the name, with fascism, we always had this pressure on us to conform to this historical ideal. That was not me. That's not why I involved myself in politics. So I was always conflicted on that point. The changing the name was something I wanted to do years ago, but we were so wrapped up in our identity with the ABP, it didn't come about until 2020. And so whereas we had formed ideas and policies on healthcare, on the economy, taxes, social policy, religion, race, things that were different than fascist Italy. The questions we were always asked were, how is this policy conformable to what Mussolini did? How is it conformable with true fascism? What do you think of the civil war in Spain? What do you think of the war in Ethiopia? And so instead of talking about our ideas and what we wanted to do, we were always stuck in the 1920s and 1930s. That's no way for a movement to grow and to succeed. So in a sense, we were becoming that reenactment group a lot of people always accused us of. Not purposely, mind you, but we had backed ourselves into the corner by adopting fascism as an identity and adopting the American Black Shirts name. So when 2020 came about, that was a major reason why we decided to discard that fascist identity and discard the American Black Shirts name. Now, there's another reason too. We had always been critical of democracy liberalism, liberal democracy, not really because of what it promoted in theory. In theory, it sounded very beautiful. Sovereignty is in the people, government represents the people, everything works out hunky-dory. Our criticism of liberal democracy was always in how it was applied, how it really worked in reality, where it failed almost every single time and led to social decay. Well, that was inconsistent with our support of fascism, because if there's something intrinsically wrong with liberal democracy based upon how it works in the real world, well, then there's something intrinsically wrong with fascism, because fascism, while it worked in theory, the one place where it was tried in reality, fascist Italy, adopted very ugly racial laws. They adopted anti-Semitism. They invaded defenseless countries, engaged in imperialism. And so must be something wrong there, because theory and application were not matching up when it came to fascism. And why I eventually rejected fascism as an idea was that it's extremely nationalistic, it's extremely militaristic. In reality, at least, it was based upon a very personalistic dictatorship. And so these three things really led to those racial laws, the anti-Semitism, and its participation in World War II and into the Holocaust to a certain extent after 1943. And I know we always tried to, with the Navy, we always tried to explain it away how this was not consistent with theory. Well, and also a lot of times we would think that, hey, Mussolini was just trying to accommodate Italy to Nazi Germany, or Hitler was putting pressure on Mussolini to implement these ideas. That was not true. And I got tired. I could no longer lie to myself about what I was promoting. Now, don't get me wrong. There are certain aspects of fascism when it has to do with the state, has to do with corporatism, that we still support. Those are aspects that that we think are good in themselves. But the extreme nationalism, the militarism, the invasions of other countries, the personal dictatorship that Mussolini implemented is not something that we were able to ignore anymore. It's not something that we could explain away. It's not something we could rationalize. There were issues with fascism that led to that, which led to its destruction. So that was another big reason why we could no longer identify with it, because it just, I mean, there were reasons why it went off the rails. I no longer think that it was an aberration. I think there was something intrinsically wrong with fascism itself. There was something intrinsically wrong with Mussolini, which led to that. And yeah, we can't sit back and deny the racial laws, the anti-Semitic laws, the alliance with Hitler. Wrong is wrong, and this is how it was applied in history. So, I mean, these two things. I mean, there were other reasons too that we decided to really discard that identity, discard the name back in 2020, and move on as our own creation. The NRP, we like to think, is something new. It's something original. It's reflective of our thought. We're not beholden. We're not prisoners to historical ideas or historical ideology. I mean, National Reformation is represented by some historical thought. It's very similar to idealist philosophy. It's very similar to early American populism as practiced in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And so it's represented by those streams of thought, but those are more reflective of what we do. We don't rely on historical models for our ideas, and we try to conform our ideas to the needs of the day. And fascism, the ABP, were holding us back in that regard. So we're looking forward to the future, keep putting out theoretical works, engage in activism, and move on as a stronger organization than we have ever been.
Oh, so it's actually gained more members.
No, we've actually lost most of the membership because of this. But I think that needed to happen because we could not go on. We had a split back in early January where we lost a significant chunk of the members. And those members were never able to move on from the old ABP, the old fascist identity. And so we're going to become stronger as a party because of that split. We're more united, we're more philosophically coherent. And I think further down the road, we're going to be able to attract a more diverse people into the organization than what we had before, and we will be a lot stronger for it. Whereas previously we had more members, but I think we were weaker as an organization because ideologically we were kind of scatterbrained, with some people believing in this, some people believing in that. And so the split we had, it was necessary, and we're going to be stronger for it in the future.
Now, regarding your getting back to corporatism, in your opinion, what was the reality of corporatism in Italy and in other fascist or semi-fascist countries like Spain under Franco, Portugal? I mean, Germany was more national socialist, but they had a corporatist element in the Deutsches Arbeitsfront and the Hitlerjugend, the unity, creating a classless society by getting everyone together and breaking down social barriers. And we can debate the merits or demerits of that. What do you think the reality of that was?
Well, the reality wasn't as ideal as we had first thought, because again, you had that disconnect between reality and theory. We loved it in theory, but it didn't work out as well in reality. I think Italy was a mixed bag as far as corporatism is concerned. And so this is what led into occupational organicity, which is what we identify with as far as our economic model is concerned. Because fascist corporatism had a fatal flaw. It was very top-heavy, run by Prime Minister, President Franco, Salazar, Mussolini, and it overwhelmingly favored, I think, corporate interest, the wealthy, at the expense of the common laborer. So you didn't have the economic growth that you would usually get from corporate theory, because corporatist theory is that because laborers and employees have more negotiating power within these businesses, it's going to lead to higher wages. It didn't work out like that in history. So corporatism was stagnant. And so occupational organicity to us, which is our current economic model, we try to reform those negative aspects of corporatism where corporatism went wrong by making the corporations themselves more integral to the economic process. So instead of having employees and laborers have formal equality within the corporation, this will give them more of an actual say. And so corporatism, I mean, it was really a mixed bag in a lot of these countries. I think fascist Italy had a lot of other issues when it came to the economy, lack of natural resources, other issues like that, the Great Depression. Spain and Portugal, their problem overwhelmingly was that they favored the wealthy landowners at the expense of industry and at the expense of employees. So they never really achieved that economic success, and it explains to a large extent why after Salazar died and his movement suddenly just basically disappeared overnight. And same thing with Franco, how the Falange were reduced to an insignificant, nothing once Franco was gone and they implemented democracy.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting critique here, that I definitely want to respond to, because my position on fascism, based on reading and whatnot, the common critique amongst the left, particularly even the Comintern, that fascism was a manservant of radical, or rather reactionary capitalism, finance capital, the last gasp of it. That's what the Comintern, Georgy Dimitrov, was saying. And I got to disagree with that. The way I look at fascism, it was neither overly friendly in reality to labor or management or the property owners. In fact, there was a report by the secret police of Italy under fascism, the OVRA, from 1931. So what had happened is that you had labor and capital being dominated in various forms. That secret police report indicated that really and truly, you had a situation where Mussolini and the Fascist Party were moving Italy, to quote the report, sweetly and silently to a form of Bolshevism. And they critiqued the upper class's antagonism towards fascism as class egoism, as they termed it, or the egoism of the bourgeoisie. And you had a lot of the anti-bourgeois propaganda campaigns, anti-bourgeois exhibits of Achilles Starese, who was one of the secretaries of the Fascist Party. So you had a lot of these radical seeds already being sown, where you're sowing a new generation of young people to be much more radical than the existing generation now that was in the upper classes and the middle classes and even the working classes. It was really truly creating a new man and a new woman through a sort of propaganda or brainwashing, and they had tremendous regimentation. You had industrialists, as time went on, being arrested left and right for a variety of political offenses as well as economic offenses. Profiteering was one charge, all the rest of it. Under the RSI, the social Italy became much more radical, at least in a de jure legal sense. The Mussolini trying to backtrack to the program of 1919. And in one book I was reading, the name escapes me, it was written, I think, in the 1940s, and it talked about fascism in Spain under Franco and the FET. And the thing is that what you had was one industrialist, the industrialists claiming that Franco and the Falange, or FET, because it was a forced merger of various parties, is more redder than the Republic, more communist than the Stalinist-dominated Republic. Because you had a lot of regulations, controls, price controls, wage controls, raw material controls. In Germany, banks couldn't even bank reports couldn't even use the word profitableness. So really, in theory, the employers did benefit, but they were also taxed very heavily. There were a lot of contributions that were forced out of them. Profits were adjusted, so to speak, by the fascist state, the Nazi state. So I look at it, in some areas, the employers benefited. I mean, they certainly did not lose their property in the titled sense, but then again, fascist and Nazi property theory of all these varying fascist dictatorships, and National Socialism is not really fascism, it's its own somewhat separate entity. I mean, all of them had their own unique theory of property, which was to fulfill a social function. And that is very threatening to a property owner who's accustomed to, in the pre-fascist or pre-Nazi, more comparatively liberal governments. That is very intimidating because that limits their sovereignty tremendously. So yeah, that's the situation with that. And that's my take on fascism. Did corporatism create this beautiful world of employer-employee holding hands together and cooperating? Of course not. It was a dictatorship over labor, from my estimation. I mean, yes, labor had certain benefits. I mean, they had the dopo lavoro. There were social welfare programs, at least on paper, and whatnot. At times, the labor courts did rule in favor of labor, of the workers, against real or perceived abuses of the employers. I mean, yes to all that. But there were also quotas Another thing I forgot, for landowners. You had to surrender as time went on crops to the state, and you could argue that's a war economy, but many fascists view that also as a permanent state of affairs. They believed in a disciplined economy. They also believed in whatever was good for the nation is the path they should pursue. So they had a semi-liberal, economically liberal form of economic structure in the first few years, 1922 to about 1924, and then afterwards the economic structure becomes more collectivistic, certainly in theory as well as practice. And even in its liberal phase, you still had strong fascist trade unions, if you will, that were very loud, and there was still government coordination. It wasn't sort of this laissez-faire paradise. So that's my view on fascism. It was a dictatorship over employers and employees. It really wasn't this true form of economic democracy, if you will, or the equalization of classes or creating a classist society. It's like communism. I mean, communism or Marxism in itself, creating a classless society and the withering of the way of the state, that sounds to the ordinary person, it sounds like a beautiful thing. But in practice, it didn't end up at that point. It got permanently stuck in the dictatorship of the proletariat phase. And in reality, it really wasn't a dictatorship of the literal proletariat. Because, well, at least in the beginning, there were a lot of strikes in Lenin's Russia. I mean, and there were a lot of reasons why you had economic problems in the early years of Bolshevik Russia. Yeah. Things in their control and things that weren't in their control. And there were still strikes periodically and labor unrest in Soviet Russia, even under Gorbachev. So, and you had massive inequality, and you had massive inequality in fascist Italy. I mean, the real ones that benefited in fascist Italy, that at the top were the fascist Ras, or chiefs, if you will, which is what that term roughly translates to. Same thing in Nazi Germany. You had the Gauleiters. You had the Gauleiters, you had the SS. At one point, you had the SA, and you had the various party bosses of all types, the Gauleiters and, you know, other types of officials, labor front functionaries, etc., on the highest level, very corrupt. I think the most balanced, if we wanted to take a model, and you and I have discussed this before, I think the mid-20th century period of the United States is the best way to go. Because no system is perfect. You're never going to have a utopia. You're never going to eliminate poverty. You're never going to eliminate class differences. But that is no excuse for trying to ameliorate things. And this is where I disagree with a lot of your hardcore conservatives, Tea Party types, and all the rest of it. You know, oh, you can't have utopia and you can't improve things. This is as good as it gets, to quote somebody. Well, no, we can do better. That's what our nationalism, my nationalism, and Urschel's nationalism is for. It's not being, again, a failing business in denial. It's how do we improve the country without throwing all the baby out with the bathwater. That's how we do it. So there's a lot of value in the classical liberal political and economic traditions, but we also realize there are built-in seeds of its own self-destruction in classical political and economic liberalism. You know, it's like a person becoming older and older and older. Well, when you become older and older and older, you can choose to continue to eat badly and not think it's ever going to catch up to you and not exercise. Or you're going to start exercising and eating better, and then you're going to look good and feel good and survive longer. Be there for your kids, your wife, your girlfriend, boyfriends, I mean, whatever you all believe in here in the audience. And that's what I kind of look at, what the reflection of the state should be. It should be continuous improvement. And that's going to have to come through And I don't know how we're going to exactly reach it, but I think it's going to take a major catastrophe or near catastrophe in this country to kind of collectively give us a jolt and wake us up, or at least a portion of the population, and say, okay, we need to make a course correction or partial course correction. And that's going to create a better society. When you have a better society, when you have shocks and events can turn large groups of people in any given society towards an extremely negative path or a very positive path. And that's what we would choose. And that's the direction where we would go. And again, that's, to repeat again, that's my conception of the state. It goes back to, as I said, in quoting President Roosevelt, in our personal ambitions, we're individualists. So that's the DNA of this country. We cannot deny that. We like our private property. We generally agree with some form of free enterprise, although that's kind of eroding now, is it? Because of what's going on now economically for 40 some odd years. We like to hold our guns and to defend ourselves, to hunt, to protect ourselves, to collect or whatever. We like to have our more or less our own belief systems, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, everything else. But in our seeking for economic and political progress as a nation, we all go up or else all go down as one people. Which means that we have to have some sort of community spirit or collectivism in order for this country to move forward and to survive. Sometimes we can't do, as a nation, we can't do things, great things, and achieve great things just as individuals alone. We have to be an organic whole at times in order to accomplish these great things. Look at NASA, cooperation with the citizenry, the private sector, and the federal government. Look at winning World War II against the Axis powers, which wanted to at best neutralize the United States. That wasn't achieved by small government people. And a lot of corporations big corporations wanted to trade with the gravediggers of capitalism. Yeah, Nazi Germany, fascist, militarist Japan, and fascist Italy. Hitler talked about, according to one defector, Kurt Ludeck, I have his book on the shelf, I Knew Hitler, gave it all his recollections. And Hitler was saying, look, I want to postpone the war against the West initially. I wanted to cry about anti-Bolshevism because, if I moved with nationalizing all the industries, like what I call for my program, too quickly in Germany, the Versailles powers, the Western powers, France, Britain, will come after me. So now I got to rearm, regiment the private sector, regulate them, but not abolish it, and claim that we're just anti-Bolshevik and that we're not really socialist to business and aristocratic classes in France and Britain, and then just build up and build up and build up. But what did Hitler say behind the scenes? Well, he said he wanted to pursue revolution. In fact, he wanted to bomb, quote, the gold hyenas and bathe them in blood in Paris and London and New York. And that doesn't sound like somebody that wants to expand capitalism now, does it? And this goes back. See, my area of interest, as the audience knows, as Josh knows, is national security. You cannot be a consistent advocate of strong national security without calling for clipping the political wings to a large degree of corporate capitalists. Because they're going to do what they're going to do. They're going to want to push for ending sanctions. One of the big things I really did not like about Ron Paul, Ron Paul would have, if Iran was willing to pay top dollar for an American nuclear reactor technology, Ron Paul would have authorized GE and other companies that specialize in the production and manufacture of nuclear reactors to export it to Islamist Iran. Because this is called the I don't give a shit version of libertarianism. I'm sorry for the profanity, but I'm sorry, I have contempt for it, because all they think about is this freedom, D-U-M-B, rather than thinking of the long-term interests of the nation, saying, hey, wait a minute, selling that nuclear reactor to Iran maybe isn't such a good thing, because they're not just going to power their nation and create electric power for their people, which is all well and good, but they're going to use it probably to develop a nuclear bomb. And I'm sorry, I don't trust Iran with a nuclear bomb or nuclear technology. I don't. And maybe that makes me too much of a political liberal. And by the way, Herschel and I on this show, we are not advocates for going into Iran and regime change either. So this is where we separate ourselves from the neocons. But the Ron Paul libertarians, well, they just don't care. Hey, it's money, it's freedom, man. Come on, let's make some money, okay? And pass me the honey. No, that's not acceptable. I know you're kind of grinning there a little bit. Come on, you got to laugh with me. I'm trying to be entertaining here, at least to the audience. But in all seriousness, and this is where, again, from my standpoint and my strong suit, which is national security, which is something that interests me, this is where I kind of turned away from libertarianism and limited government conservatism, as I said. Because if we sell that reactor to Iran, which probably would make a nuclear bomb with it, that the American nation doesn't go up. It goes down. It makes us fall together. You know, or selling nuclear technology to Russia and China, which we had done. So it's interesting. It's almost like in the name of liberalism or preserving liberalism, there, because of the depredations of capitalism and the proliferation of a short-sighted individualism in our society, in order to survive, you have to take limited illiberal measures without lurching too far into dictatorship, where you have zero accountability, in my opinion. You have to take illiberal measures at times in order for the nation to survive. And that comes with redeveloping the Constitution, continuing many of the rights that we have, but also adding new things. Let's take a look at FDR's Second Bill of Rights, incorporating some of those planks there. Also in the preamble of the Constitution, maybe adding another preamble about economic equilibrium and balancing capitalism with the needs of the national security as a whole. You know, maybe we need to elaborate some of the responsibilities and duties of the upper classes and society as a whole to the preservation of the long-range survival of the nation. I mean, these are just ideas. Of course, constitutional scholars and lawyers would need to really inject that into a new constitution. And having a constitution will set the parameters of what the government can and cannot do. And that's how you would stave off any legitimate fears and concerns of an unaccountable collectivist dictatorship. But one of the most pressing national security threats is the uncontrolled influence of corporate capitalism and globalism. It's a national security from the domestic front because of the proliferation, slowly but surely, of extremist groups. Look at Democratic Socialists of America. They have at least 60,000 people. And that group has become more and more radical by the minute. I mean, there was an article on World Socialist website, WSW.org, which is the DSA people all over the place. DSA leaders on a chapter level are praising the assassination of Leon Trotsky by Soviet NKVD agents. I mean, really? Yeah, it makes me angry because I'm a virulent, radical anti-communist. I don't like extreme forms of socialism. But this crap doesn't happen in a vacuum. Look at your path. This is one of the reasons why we're having Josh on this show to begin with. Because we want to show the world that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I praise Josh for having the intellectual honesty to depart from fascism and at least not going back to reactionary conservatism or the old Republican Party or moving towards National Socialism or communism. At least he's trying to develop his own ideology here. And that's what we're trying to do on this show too as well. But again, people are not attracted to fascism. People of good faith are not attracted to fascism or National Socialism or communism. They are attracted to it. Why? Well, because of the failure of our society by first world standards. I mean, if you compare what's going on here versus Cuba or Venezuela, I mean, there's no contest. I take this country any day with both eyes closed. But we can do a lot better. We can. And this is where I think over the years, Josh and I, even though we have virulent disagreement on things, and that's fine, but we have common paths of disillusionment with conservatism, with Reaganism. Because conservatism really has not conserved anything really to speak of. We have more crime, more drug overdoses. We have China and Russia becoming stronger when many conservatives were saying we won the Cold War. When Russia repositioned itself and relabeled itself, the old wine in new bottles. China is still outwardly communist. You have communism spreading throughout Latin America. You have Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. You had Bolsonaro defeating Lula da Silva and the Marxist Workers' Party, and now it looks like the Workers' Party is moving back into power. You know, you have all this going on. Oh, I thought the Cold War was ending. Yes, it didn't. You have the growth of abortion, which accelerated in the 1980s. Second biggest reason why women get abortions is because of economic stress. Well, isn't that interesting? Because wages have continued to fall since the 1970s, and productivity and work hours have gone up mysteriously. But people can't afford to have families. Well, where's the party of family values? Why aren't they calling for paid maternity leave, better wages, create, stronger unions, which translates into rising wages? And these are the disconnects that led Josh and I and Herschel and others of varying political stripes to become disillusioned with, because the fact of the matter is that conservatism in its Reaganite incarnation only seeks to conserve and preserve two things, and even expand two things. The right of the employers to do whatever the hell they want vis-a-vis their employees, and B, the political power and the aggregate wealth of the private sector oligarchs. What else is conservatism preserved? Sure, you can ban abortion, but how are people going to afford bigger families to have more kids if you can't afford to have children? You can't have it both ways. You could be for free trade with China and against tariffs on dumped goods from communist China, but yet you claim that China and Russia are big threats. I mean, all these Tea Party Republicans in the Senate, for example, aligned themselves with Barack Hussein Obama in 2012 to give permanent normal trade relations to the crypto-communist Russian government. But yet, at the same time, they call for not ratifying the New START Treaty of Obama, which would have limited the U.S. nuclear arsenal even further while Russia was violating it, which the Republicans were right to oppose. It's these built-in contradictions of so-called conservatism that doesn't make it conservative, because they're not conserving anything. They are one of the factors in the acceleration of the decline of the United States of America. This is why, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I could never join the Republican Party again unless they go back to Theodore Roosevelt style republicanism or Abraham Lincoln style republicanism. No, Reaganism has failed us. Reaganism is the freeway to a socialist United States, to a collectivist United States. Working Americans are burned out. They're not happy. There have been polls even under the Trump administration, which shows that more and more Americans have lost faith in the United States, that we are losing track on what's important in the United States. Things have got to change dramatically away from neoliberalism. Because in the end, we're going to lose rights to free speech, private property, the right to own a firearm, the right to have parental control over your kids. Because then you're going to have demagogues, and Donald Trump is no populist, and he's a joke. And there's a 25%, 30% I agreed with this administration. The rest was either I was neutral or thought it was a disaster. And I supported Trump in 2016, vocally too. You're going to have extremists taking an example of that. The country is going to collapse. We already see the fault lines occurring in this country. I know I'm speaking a long time, but I'm very passionate about this. Josh already knows that. Josh, what do you see for the future of the United States? And do you see positive change from your perspective coming about? And I'm going to let you speak for 10 minutes.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how long I can go on, but I don't see anything much positive in the near future. I do see in the distant future some positive things happening. I do think that when enough people cannot support themselves, when enough people cannot survive on their income, when they can't afford a house, when they can't afford rent payments, when they can't afford to have a family, that's going to wake something up within people. Because these are basic fundamental human needs. And if they cannot be met, I think I think something is going to happen where there's going to be change, and the powers that be are not going to be able to deny that. And so, like I said earlier, the problem I have with revolutions is that they come about when society's not ready for that change. And so you have tyranny, you have oppression on top from the revolutionary group that assumes power. But when enough people are not able to support themselves, when their livelihoods become destitute, then change will happen regardless, because you can't continue, like you said, when things collapse, there's going to be change that comes about because there's no other alternative. There has to be some kind of power center. There has to be some kind of philosophy built upon practical needs, upon supporting yourself, upon supporting family. Lacking that, society cannot continue. But society will continue because you have to have it. So you have a contradiction there that's going to eventually get worked out. So I don't know when that's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to be the near future, distant future. I think it's going to happen sometime. Maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly afterwards. Now, for those changes to be sustainable, though, we have to have a fundamental change in philosophy, in philosophical outlook, because you can't just have the present structure as it currently exists and have a greater redistribution of wealth, maybe some more restrictions on corporate America, or else you're going to have those changes be undermined again. Because you brought this up earlier. There's really a false dichotomy between small and large government. We have a large government now, so people think that large government automatically equals incompetence, it equals tyranny. But what they don't realize is that this large government serves corporate interests. It serves the business interests of America. So it really, that largeness doesn't translate over into authority, and it doesn't translate over into power. And that is the problem. That's what we need to fix. We need to have a coherent state, a state that really is capable, which is independent of corporate and business interests, so it's able to ethically govern the country and really create an environment for families to thrive, to individuals to thrive, for government to really work out. And there's one other thing that's really fundamentally important when it comes to this. We have to get over this divide between left and right. Because what we see now is a government that can't function, a government that cannot provide for the future because it has false divisions in it. Think about it. And we talk about this a lot within the NRP, the unity of opposites. We have in our society, within families, large families especially, you may have a son who was born and brought up, and he turns out to be a political conservative. You may have other children after that. You may have a daughter come who's raised very similarly. That is a political liberal. What explains this diversity of thought? What explains these differences? After all, if the biological theory of humanity is true, then people who are more biologically similar should have similar outlooks on life, similar political beliefs. But that is not true. And what we found out is that left and right are natural outgrowths of society. You can't have a society which is solely on the right or one that is solely on the left, because if you have that, you are suppressing a natural part of society. And so for a government to function effectively, it cannot just be from the left or the right. It has to accommodate both of those. Think about when you were little, when you were growing up and you first became interested in politics, and I can draw on my own life experience as well. Growing up, before we actually become involved in, one of the two political parties, you may have views which are on the left, you may have some views which are on the right. Most people have a mixture of the two. This is healthy. This is natural. But when they get involved in the political process and in political parties, they either go hard right, hard left. That is not natural. Those are false divisions. And that's currently what we have in Washington, D.C. And it's a big reason why, like you said, we cannot at this point change the Constitution, change our laws to be more equitable, more just, and more fair, because you have these false divisions which get in the way constantly. So left and right, in reality, are two sides of the same continuum. They both have a purpose. They both have a point. They work with each other to function really well. So this Republican-Democratic divide is a fake one. It's a false one. If we have a philosophy built upon unity, built upon people working together, which I think is going to transcend, which I think is going to supersede classical liberalism, which we reference as National Reformationism. We can have a government which is going to be effective and it'll work, because left and right are the same sides of a continuum. You can't have a government which functions one way or the other. They have to work together. They are functional to each other, just like men and women. Just like a scientist is to a soldier or to a military personnel. You can't have a military without an intellect or a science community. All these differences we see in society within politics are functional. And so we have to get, as a society, we have to get rid of these false divisions and false divides which really define us as a country. And I think once that happens, and it will happen, I'm 100% confident on that over time, we can look forward to a better future.
So, there is a way forward. And yes, I mean, when we say the reconciliation of the left and right, I mean, of course, that is very common in, fascist and National Socialist circles, they'll claim, for example, they're part of the left in some cases. Like Mussolini said, this is a century of corporatism, a century of the left, and a century of labor, but others will say we transcend right and left. And radical civic nationalism or patriotic populism is the same way too. We kind of reject the left and the right as it's currently configured today. We can use and understand and recognize the legitimacy of critiques of corporate capitalism of the left and of fascism by the left and by fascists without adopting their program. We can use those critiques, listen to it, legitimize it, and say, look, you have a point, without adopting their program or platform. And just by strengthening capitalism into, a form of capitalism that we used to have to some degree in this country before Reagan and neoliberalism, we can recognize the many merits in political liberalism, but at the same time also realize that it contains built-in seeds of its own self-destruction when not properly structured or restructured in a progressive fashion. Progressive meaning as the country evolves and society becomes more complex with new challenges or unaddressed old challenges. So what we do is then we go to the drawing board, and again, unlike a failing business in denial, we go to the drawing board and improve it. But I agree with you, Josh. The only way these changes can come about is you have to have a population that is awake and that is truly ready and open for changes to enhance the prolong the survivability of the United States. And that's going to require a new ethos of leadership, very different from what we have right now. To give you an example of what we have now, many of our congressmen and senators, they have to spend, according to one estimate, 40% of his or her time on something called call time, which is soliciting wealthy donors, which is the most degrading thing a leadership class can do, because it shows who really governs the nation, doesn't it? It's degrading. And these are the same. There are many patriotic business people and wealthy people out there. It's not insignificant. I've met some of them personally. These are good men and women. But you also have many that have, when the poop hits the fan in the United States and even the world war, natural disaster, they have, according to even the mainstream press, openly talks about it. They've been converting decommissioned missile silos, building bunkers in them, reconverting them, repurposing them to luxury bunkers. So when the poop hits the fan or there's a world war, they're just going to flee aboard their private planes and private helicopters there and going to ride it out until conditions improve, while the rest of the people suffer. These are, collectively speaking, many of the same individuals that are for extending trade privileges to China, to the Soviet Union, to Nazi Germany, militarist Japan, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Iran, and the Ayatollahs. They're all there. Many are for this trade and liberalization with the most hostile regimes, or destroying our supply chain in the United States. Now in the news, we see photographs even of all these ships moored offshore from the port of Long Beach in California, amongst other places. You have supply chain breakdowns. Well, this didn't happen because as an accident. This occurred because many within the 1%, through their political allies in Congress and various presidents, they chose, in the name of free trade globalism and enhanced profits and a flawed foreign policy idea of entangling alliances, to offshore much of our industrial production, and even in some cases agricultural production and mineral extraction. So seriously, why should the 1% have this extreme influence in American politics? No, a new form of leadership will not be spending 40% of their time in call time begging them for donations. No, society will eventually learn, at least in my ideal society, the upper classes will learn at times the state is there not only, yes, to protect them, to protect their class interests, and there's nothing wrong with that to a degree, but also that the state needs to be obeyed at times in the name of national survivability, because they are failing us, left, right, and center. I've listed this. This is where their hearts are at. So if the country goes down the tubes, they're fleeing. That's the ultimate cowardice. That's not a leadership class. I mean, if anything, a leadership class should be intellectual, warrior intellectuals, who a sort of old aristocratic ideal, if you will, of really doing the right thing, to use that overused phrase. Any concluding thoughts about what I've said, what you'd like to add, any information about, any websites, phone numbers, emails, social media presence of the National Reformation Party?
I think, Nevin, that while we do have some differences, I think we agree on more than we disagree. There's a fundamental flaw and defect in how our society is governed, in our politics, in our social philosophy, which needs to be addressed. Now, we don't agree on all the methods and means to fix it, but I think there's a lot of room for us to work together. If you're listening to me for the first time, if you're not familiar with the National Reformation Party, check us out on nationalreformation.org. We are also on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. Our YouTube page has a ton of narrations by myself. We have roundtables that we have me and others within the party participate, and we talk about current affairs, contemporary issues. So if you're interested in that, give us a shot. Figure out what we stand for. If you agree with us, if you want to join, there's a membership tab on the website. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, any concerns. I can be reached at contact@nationalreformation.org. And again, I hope this is the beginning of several of these that we can do in the future. And check us out. I also write extensively on the website. If you go under the Chronicles section, under Noyer's Thoughts, you can read a lot of my articles that I put out, and a lot of the members write as well, along with a lot of historical material from idealist philosophers, from Populist, early American populists from the American tradition. A lot of that is available. We concentrate a lot on the history as well. We have our Decalogue, social action plan, all that. So if you're interested in what I've had to say, go ahead and take a look at us and give our material a read.
Well, that all sounds great, Josh. I look forward to having you back on the show. I mean, there are definitely points of agreement in the critique of the system. And I definitely appreciate the fact that you really moved away from fascism. I mean, this show opposes totalitarianism in all its forms, but we also, at the same time, we also understand why people get attracted initially to those ideologies. We also understand through historical proof that fascism, National Socialism, communism, Islamism attract, and often they go to leadership. They become, I don't want to say successful leaderships, but they enter leadership successfully. Very morally objectionable individual, even criminal elements. In the case of fascist Italy, you had the activities of the Black Brigades. In the Social Republic, you have Mussolini himself. You have Giovanni Preziosi, who was one of their leading anti-Semitic leaders within the Fascist Party of Italy, as well as Roberto Farinacci, who was initially involved in the PSI, the Italian Socialist Party, was a socialist interventionist, and then he became a fascist chieftain, amongst various other titles that he's held. Extraordinarily corrupt and extraordinarily brutal, and was a radical influence within an already ideologically radical fascist party. So you get those elements. And of course, communism, there's no shortage of criminal and psychopathic elements as well. And certainly in Nazi Germany, not only Hitler in many ways, but also Hermann Goering, who was a drug addict. You had Joseph Goebbels, who was an extremely resentful, bitter, brilliant man. You have Robert Ley, who was a drunk and extremely corrupt, along with Goering and Goebbels. And various Gauleiters were also a disaster, not to mention the manic brutality and cruelty of SS officials. So, the list goes on and on. But if you want to prevent these organizations, these ideologies from triumphing in nation after nation, well, part of it is we have to stop being like a failing business in denial. See, I came up with a new analogy, which I think works very well for our purposes tonight. So thank you again, Josh, for joining us. I look forward to more interviews. I'm probably going to be doing some interviews as well with future guests, not only Josh, but also going to be kind of searching out a couple of, additional writers, political activists, labor union activists, and whatnot in the near future. So I thank you all for joining us. I wish you a great weekend. God bless America. Stay healthy, stay safe, and good night.